Okay, thanks, Quinn. As Quinn said, I'm Mike White. I'm a professor at Arizona State University, and I'm also co-director of our training and technical assistance team for BJA's body-worn camera PIP program. Do want to give a quick shout out to John Markovic, senior policy advisor at BJA. John's on the webinar as well. We may hear from John a bit later. So I'm going to be I guess, the facilitator for this event, and I just want to give a couple of opening remarks about how we have it organized, and then set the stage a bit before I turn it over to Doctors Peterson and Cunningham. So, really, there are two parts of this webinar that we have today. The first part, as Quinn said, we have Doctors Cunningham and Peterson, who are both from CNA, who are going to present some results from a recently completed study of correctional body-worn cameras. That is the rollout of body-worn cameras in the adult detention center in Loudoun County. So that's the first part. We'll hear about some of those results. The second part is a panel discussion. And as Quinn said, we've got some esteemed panelists here that are going to offer their thoughts about the study, the results that are presented, as well as more generally, body-worn cameras in correctional settings. And as Quinn said, the panelists include Captain David Wozniak from Loudoun County. So we'll hear Captain Wozniak's thoughts about the study, the results, the probably somewhat tedious relationship with CNA as they carried out this study. And then also Major Jody Hatfield from Sandusky County, Ohio, Mr. Ben Collins from Washington, D.C. Department of Corrections, and Sheriff Paul Laney representing the National Sheriff's Association. So those are the two parts of the webinar. And just to kind of set the stage before I kick it over to Brittany and Bryce, most of us know that law enforcement agencies in the United States have been deploying cameras for some time now, well over a decade. And the goals of those police leaders that have made the decision to deploy body-worn cameras are fairly straightforward. They're things like enhancing accountability, improving transparency for the community, perhaps reducing use of force and complaints, optimizing the evidentiary value of the footage. And there's now a large body of research that has shown that in a law enforcement setting, body-worn cameras can deliver on a lot of those promises, on a lot of those goals. But the question we're here today to wrestle with is, what about a correctional setting? We have a rapidly growing number of local and county jails, state prison systems that are making the decision to deploy cameras in their custodial institutions. And they have many of the same goals that police leaders have, like accountability, like improving transparency, like reducing force, like optimizing the evidentiary value of the footage. So the question really is, can body-worn cameras deliver also in correctional settings? And I think we can all acknowledge that the correctional setting is very, very different from a law enforcement setting. The custodial nature, for example, the interactions between correctional officers and inmates is fundamentally different than an interaction between a police officer and a community member on the street. Not to mention the presence of all the fixed cameras that are already in a correctional institution. So that question of whether body-worn cameras can deliver on some of the goals in a correctional setting is what we're here about. And to be quite honest, it is an unanswered question, at least till now. We're going to hear now, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany and Bryce, and they're going to talk about what I think is really a first of its kind study that seeks to answer that question about whether body-worn cameras can produce those same kinds of positive outcomes in a local jail. So with that, I'll kick it over to Brittany and Bryce, and we can hear about some of the results from that study.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Brittany Cunningham. I was one of the co-principal investigators on our study. We're really excited to present today on our findings from our evaluation of body-worn cameras in the Loudoun County Jail. We were funded by the National Institute of Justice, and we completed our study in partnership with the National Sheriff's Office as well as Loudoun County. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that without Loudoun County's support and without Captain Wozniak, who is here today with us, our study would not have been so successful or possible. So I do want to thank Captain Wozniak and his colleagues at Loudoun for putting up with us researchers for a couple years. We do actually think from our own knowledge, this is the very first randomized control trial of body-worn cameras in a jail setting. Now, the goal of our study was to conduct a rigorous process and impact evaluation of body-worn cameras in a correctional setting to inform researchers and practitioners about the implementation and potential impacts of body-worn cameras on critical correctional outcomes. And we'll talk about those outcomes a little bit later. So to achieve this, we did implement a 12-month clustered randomized control trial from November 2020 to October 2021. So right in the middle of COVID. So again, without the support of Loudoun County, we would not have been so successful. So I do want to always point that out. Our evaluation components included a couple of things. So surveys of correctional deputies, an impact analysis of response to resistance and injuries. We also reviewed response to resistance footage, reviewing both body-worn cameras and stationary cameras, and conducted a cost-effective analysis. Now, one of the other goals, and Mike talked a little bit about this, of our study was to fill that research gap that exists on the implementation of body-worn cameras or the implications of body-worn cameras in correctional setting. Mike mentioned at the start that there is quite a bit of research out there on the impacts of body-worn cameras on law enforcement, but that research in correctional setting is barely exists right now. So we wanted to start building that base with our study. So I want to draw your attention to the figure you see on the right hand of your screen. So this is actually what we did. So before the start of each month, we randomly assigned 12 units, so 8 housing units and 4 general units, so that deputies in 6 units would be required to wear a body-worn camera during both the day and night shifts for the entire month, while deputies in the other 6 units would continue business as usual, so without body-worn cameras. At the conclusion of our 1-year randomized control trial, there was a total of 72 treatment conditions, so units with body-worn cameras, and 72 control units without body-worn cameras. We did achieve a high fidelity rate with an error rate by shift equal to 4.2%. So let's jump into a little bit more of the results, and I am going to hand it over to Bryce to get us started.
Thanks, Brittany. So the way we're going to present these results, I will say up front, for every slide that we have here, there's a 30-page journal article behind it, meaning there's a lot of data and analysis that went into these results, and a lot of takeaways, policy implications, and other conclusions for every analysis that we did. We're happy to talk more in detail about that or share drafts of the manuscripts we have in place. But what I want to do today is just highlight some of the big takeaways from these studies. So that way we can give you kind of a flavor of what we found and what we think the biggest impacts are of body cameras in correctional settings. So I'm going to start with our analysis of deputy perspectives. So what we did is we surveyed deputies at 3 periods of time. Before they received body cameras, so in September 2020, kind of halfway through our 1-year study period, and then at the end of the study period. So this allowed us to look at deputy perspectives over time, before they got body cameras, after, and then longer after, just to see if their perspectives changed over time. At each wave, we had pretty good response rates, so we feel confident that our findings at least reflect the current roster of staff that were in place at the time that we did these surveys. I will also say, just as a context point, on every slide, there'll be a box that just says findings. Those are kind of the big high-level takeaways from each one of the analyses that we did. So you can kind of draw your attention there, but we did try to include some other bar charts and information just to delve a little bit deeper into what we found. So going into the deputy perspectives, we measured a couple different things. So each of these measures on the screen here, efficiency and accuracy, resident civilizing effect, work disruptions, and resident deputy relationships. Each of those are comprised of multiple questions on a survey. So for example, for efficiency and accuracy, we asked a number of questions related to whether deputies felt that body cameras made their jobs easier, provided more accurate account of what transpired when they interacted with incarcerated residents, and a couple other things. And the same is true for each of those other measures. So these are basically what we call composite outcomes, where we took a number of questions, we summarized and took the average across all of those questions and created this composite measure that tells us a little bit about these outcomes. One other just context point, in general, in our publications in here, we use the term incarcerated resident instead of inmate, but we mean it as the same thing. Looking across these outcomes, what you can see here is in general, deputies were relatively neutral or somewhat negative about body cameras. A response average of 3 tells you that they neither disagreed or agreed with the question. Anything below 3 is negative, anything above 3 is positive. So, and again, most of the responses hovered around 3. And that's true across time. They neither agreed nor disagreed that body cameras made their jobs easier, made them more efficient or accurate. They tended to disagree that body cameras had a civilizing effect on incarcerated residents. They also disagreed that body cameras cause work disruption. The only area where we see any sort of significant changes or over time is on that final column, which is resident-deputy relationships. So what we found was a slight decline over time in deputies' perceptions of the relationships with residents. I'll talk more about at the conclusion of our presentation why that might be the case, but suffice to say for now at least that that's the only area where we saw any sort of changes over time is the deputies' perceptions of their relationships with people in the jail. Otherwise, again, they stayed pretty much the same over time and they were neutral or slightly negative. I would call this the meat of our analysis. This is where we looked at the impact that body cameras had on critical correctional outcomes. So we measured 2 things here. We looked at response to resistance, which if people aren't familiar with that term, it's essentially a measure of use of force. Captain Wozniak can talk more about this if he'd like, but the Loudoun County used to measure uses of force, and they switched to a measure of response to resistance, which is a little bit more comprehensive, but it measures a similar construct. It's when a deputy is responding to resistance from an incarcerated resident. So we looked at the number of RTRs. I'll just use the word RTR just for shorthand. The number of RTR events per month, as well as the number of injuries to residents during these RTRs. We were going to look at injuries to deputies too, but there was no injuries over our study period, so we didn't include that in our analysis. We used something called negative binomial regression without getting too much into it. Essentially, what I'll be showing you on the next 2 slides is the result of this analysis, and it tells you the average monthly count of each of these 2 outcomes per unit per month. So the number of RTRs and the number of injuries. So here's the big first takeaway. In housing units over the 1-year study period, in housing units that had body cameras, there were fewer RTRs per month than there were in housing units that did not have body cameras. So we had, it's a low baseline in total, but still a significant reduction. So we had about just over half, so 0.55 response to resistance events in each housing unit when they had body cameras, and housing that did not have body cameras over the same period of time, we predicted 0.92 response to resistance events. So the big takeaway is, again, body cameras appeared to have reduced the number of RTRs. And we had similar findings for injuries. So not only are body cameras reducing responses to resistance, they're also reducing the number of injuries that occur in those response to resistance events. So we, again, see a very low baseline, but still a significant reduction that we can associate to body cameras. The 0.07 injuries on average per month in facilities that had body cameras, and 0.17 injuries on average per month in housing units that did not have body cameras. So again, body cameras seem to have reduced injuries. I'm going to kick it back over to Brittany, I think, for the next section to talk about some other findings related to investigations into RTR events.
Thanks, Bryce. So we did develop a methodology for reviewing and assessing information gathered from Loudoun's body-worn cameras and stationary cameras. This was probably my favorite part of the analysis that we did. You'll see that on the right-hand screen, we do have a research brief that's coming out in the next couple of weeks that really is just on what we reviewed and the outcomes. So what I'm going to present here is just an overview, again, just due to time today. We reviewed 13 randomly selected RTR events and pulled video footage from all cameras that capture these 13 events, so including both body-worn cameras and stationary cameras. In total, we reviewed 46 body-worn cameras and 48 stationary cameras. Here, we were interested in learning how information differs across these 2 types of cameras. And we reviewed things such as event details, the audio and video quality of the footage, the actions of the residents and deputies, injuries, and the disposition of the event. So overall, our finding was body-worn cameras and stationary cameras complement each other. You'll see our kind of overall finding here. Again, body-worn cameras and stationary cameras complement one another. There are a couple differences that you'll see in the blue and green circles on the screen. So stationary cameras provide overhead views compared to the first-person view of body-worn cameras. stationary cameras lack the detail that body-worn cameras can capture, but also body-worn cameras have the potential for views to be obstructed by correctional deputies or by residents. Also, the stationary cameras did not capture audio, but body-worn cameras did. And the audio provided important additional context to understand the situation or the RTR event, such as tone of voice and the verbal exchanges between correctional deputies or between correctional deputies and residents. So to sum this kind of part up, the stationary cameras and body-worn cameras provide more complete evidence of what transpired in an event or an RTR event rather than one camera type by themselves. Let me turn it back over to Bryce and we'll talk about the last piece of our analysis, which was on cost effectiveness.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that people do cost analyses or cost benefit analyses. I'm going to talk about our approach, which was what we call a cost effectiveness analysis. It's a very simple way to understand costs and relate them to the outcomes that you examine in a study. So on the one, so it's a very simple equation. It's a ratio. So you have the total cost of the program divided by the unit change in the outcome. So in this case, we have two outcomes that we examined primarily, which is our response to resistant events and injuries. So I'll talk about each of those two components of the equation very quickly. So for the program costs, these are the total costs of implementing the program that we estimated in Loudoun County over this one-year study period. So the equipment and startup costs were about $106,000. That's the cameras and other equipment that goes along with it, kind of the hardware associated with it and some software. The training costs, so these are the time for personnel, so mostly deputies and IT, who had to learn how to use the body cameras and prepare for implementation. And then there was a cost associated with response to resistance investigations. So this was kind of an interesting and somewhat surprising finding in that body cameras actually increase the amount, the cost of investigating response to resistant investigations. Prior research has shown that you can save time and money by having body cameras because it provides, an account of what happened and allows investigators to get to an outcome more quickly. However, what we found was even though there was fewer response to resistant events because of body cameras, the time spent on each of those response to resistant events went up. So in Loudoun County, I believe it's a lieutenant level staff member who does most of the investigation when a response to resistance occurs. And now, even though before they had CCTV footage that they might review and other evidence, now because there's body cameras, there's much more footage that lieutenants had to review in order to investigate a response to resistant event. So again, even though there's fewer overall RTRs, the total cost actually went up in housing units where there were body cameras, primarily because lieutenants had to spend more time reviewing that body camera footage. All that being said, the total cost of implementing this program, we estimated to be about $158,000 over the course of 1 year, but that did result in 27 fewer RTRs and 8 fewer injuries. With our cost effectiveness analysis, what we're essentially showing is that for every $5,800 spent on the program, that resulted in 1 fewer RTR. And for every almost $20,000 spent on the program, that resulted in 1 fewer injury. If people were to take, there's other ways to do cost analyses where then you try to attach, you try to monetize or attach costs to these outcomes. So you might say, for example, well, 1 injury is worth $30,000, therefore this program is cost beneficial. We chose not to do that because it's very hard to come up with those costs. So we just left it like this, which is showing you that even though there's costs in the program, for every dollar spent on the program, it did result in these significant outcomes. Okay, last slide, and I'll go ahead and summarize some of our findings, some of what we've talked about. So in short, we think body cameras are promising, right? We think that what we found was that they reduced uses of force, or in this case, RTRs. They reduced injuries to incarcerated residents. We found that they augmented, enhanced, or added to existing CCTV surveillance networks that are already found in correctional facilities. And so the argument that body cameras aren't needed because there's already cameras in facilities may not hold water. We found that they complement each other and that they could be useful even in places where there's a saturation of video feeds. So there's definitely some promises there. There's also some challenges. So in general, correctional deputies don't seem too keen on body cameras. They don't dislike them or like them. So whether that's a good or a bad finding, we're not entirely sure. It does differ from most of the policing research, especially more recent research, which shows that in general, police officers embrace body cameras, want the body cameras. Correctional deputies, and this might be unique to Loudoun County. It might be unique to the fact that this study was conducted during COVID, whatever it is in Loudoun County. If we had to put it in one word, it'd be meh. That's kind of how deputies responded to body cameras in general. And there is some evidence that perhaps, at least from deputies' perspective, staff-resident relationships declined over time. So I said when I presented that originally that I would talk a little bit more about why that's the case. We don't know exactly why, but we can speculate based on some interviews that we did and some of the open-ended response questions that we had in our survey. Deputies noted that when they wore body cameras, they felt like incarcerated residents were less willing to talk to them. So whether it's people, informants, or whatever that relationship may be, they felt like sometimes when they were wearing a body camera, that kind of hindered their ability to build and strengthen relationships with people inside jail. So that could be what's causing this perception of body cameras to go down over time. The other kind of elephant in the room, I guess you could say, is that this entire study occurred during COVID. COVID didn't happen in the middle. COVID had already happened, and then we did our study. But this entire study period happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's impossible to disentangle any impact that might have had on any of our outcomes and the impact that body cameras directly had on our outcomes because they were all happening together. So that's kind of one challenge or one limitation of our study. And then the last thing I'll say is it's important to note that our study was done in a single jail, so small to mid-sized jail in a specific geographic region. That, like all facilities, it's very different than any other jail. It's especially different from larger correctional facilities. Jails in general are very different from prisons. And so although we see some promise in body cameras in correctional settings, we think it's vitally important that we conduct more research and replicate this study in other kinds of correctional settings to get a better sense about the impact of body cameras.
Like I said, we're going to have a panel discussion. I know that at least a couple of questions have come in already from attendees, and what we'll do is we'll leave 10 minutes or so at the end for the researchers to address those questions. But what I wanted to do first is really kick it over to Captain Wozniak to give him an opportunity to talk about the study, the findings, the partnership with CNA, and then we can move on to the other panelists and get their thoughts too. But first, let's hear from Captain Wozniak.
Thanks, Mike. My name is Captain Wozniak. I'm from Loudoun County, Virginia. We had a 3-year partnership with CNA during during, and kind of post COVID-19, which had its own challenges as far as the surveys and things like that, a lot of non-contact stuff. It was some of the stuff that was involved in this study while we were doing it was, yes, the time per investigation did go up. One of the things that I have seen as I review all of these that came across my desk was there was more time spent on the investigation. However, I got a much clearer and cleaner product. There was no misrepresentation. Everything was there. I was a very big supporter of getting body cams here at our jail. We all know that all of us in the profession of jails or prisons that are CCTVs, they lack that dynamic of audio for the most part. And nothing ever looks good on just tape. So we get the actual what the officer is being presented with, and we get a clearer view of the actual incident itself. And I strongly encourage anybody who's looking at getting body cams to, if they can do it, jump into it, and I think they will not be disappointed. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Captain. So I've got a series of questions. I'd like all the panelists to think about, but first, let's focus on the findings themselves. So you heard about a series of findings: response to resistance, injury, cost for Mr. Collins, for Major Hatfield, for Sheriff Laney. And although I'm a college professor, I'm not going to call anyone. I'm going to ask for volunteers. Would one of the three of you like to, or all of you, chime in on those findings? What did you find most compelling as you listen to this presentation? What stuck with you?
I'll go ahead and take that. My name is Jody Hatfield from Sandusky County Sheriff's Office. I took over the jail facility a couple years ago. After coming in here, we were looking at the changes and everything that needed made back in here. My correction deputies actually came to me for the body cameras. It was a big push by them. They actually started doing their own research, coming with policies to look at from counties that had implemented them and everything else. So when we started looking at them and how to implement them, I had the support of everybody that was working back here that wanted to deal with that. And since I've been asked to be on this, I've sat down and talked with them more and more. And what they have seen in our facility is the individuals that are incarcerated with us are aware they're there. So it's taken our RTRs, which have dropped tremendously. Some of our investigations or some of our complaints we've had, as soon as we pull up the body worn camera along with the other cameras, it makes the investigation more complete and like the captain said, easier to establish everything that has went on. With the cost factor, our road department had already been inside of it, so it was just an add-on to the system. So when we looked at the cost and everything that was capable of doing, it made it a little easier for us to implement it back here inside the jail facility.
Great, thank you, sir. Mr. Collins, Sheriff Laney, any thoughts?
Yeah, Sheriff Laney with the National Sheriff's Association. I've been retired now for a couple of years, but I've stayed pretty engaged in the game here. And my facility was a 350 bed facility. And I kind of had the same reactions as we started transitioning to a lot of this, especially in the field. And as we started discussing in my time transitioning out with the jail, was my deputies were receptive of it. And I know there was a question in there, what's the difference between a deputy and a correctional officer? None. In my department, it's a lot about individual organizations, how they refer to their people. All my correctional officers, while they may not have been licensed peace officers, were still referred to as a deputy with the Cass County Sheriff's Office. So I hope that kind of answers you the question about the difference between a deputy and a CO. There isn't, it's just more their title. But what I started seeing a lot of times, I think it's a lot in how it's presented from the administration to your people. So many times when you come in, like when we first introduced the GPSs into the squad cars, what was the initial reaction? Well, you just want to see where we're at to see if we're screwing off. No, it's easier for dispatch to dispatch quicker and better response times because we can pull from the cars that are in that environment. Same kind of environment when you want to put body worn cameras into that environment isn't so much it's the gotcha. We're not putting them on you for the gotcha. We're putting them on you because we want to be able to show that you're doing it right. Because there's so much a wave across this country right now about law enforcement and deputies doing it wrong. And our people aren't doing that. Yes, have there been some incidents? Of course there have been. But in the average, those are the people we keep in our departments, and those aren't the people that we're working with every single day. Our deputies are doing it right. Our correctional officers are doing it right. And we've all been there. If any of you have been in a situation when you're doing an RTR, which for the other question in there, a response to resistance is the evaluation of use of force. Response to resistance is probably the more politically correct term in this day and age, to evaluating force that was used to contain a situation. And what I found when I'd be looking at the fixed cameras, it shows you the overview of what's happening. But you look at on a fixed camera, 5 deputies, holding somebody down. It looks like a massive pig pile. And man, what are they doing to that poor person? They're trying to hold them down and restrain them. And then you can go to the body worn camera and you can hear your deputies calm down, settle down. We just need you to calm down. It puts in a whole different perspective of what's happening. And what are you doing? You're catching your deputies doing it right and are able to utilize that. So we had really a good support for the most part. With a lot of it, I had the same situation as Major Hatfield. Our deputies wanted them.
Thanks, Sheriff. Mr. Collins, how about your experience in Washington, D.C.?
Well, first, I just want to kind of piggyback off of the study. As it mentioned, the investigations, that's kind of like my background. And the body worn cameras have tremendously enhanced an investigator's ability to not only administratively, and we have quite a few criminal investigations as well in our facilities. And the body worn camera is a tremendous tool. It actually takes investigations to just a different level. I wish we would have had that kind of thing when I was a young homicide detective years ago, but it's a tremendous tool. I don't see where the time of the investigations expanded on our end. I think in many cases, especially administratively, it kind of cut short some of the investigative processes we may have had to go through had we not had the body-worn cameras. In many cases, the body-worn cameras take you directly to exactly the meat of exactly what happened. In terms of the criminal investigations, yes, because you really want to incorporate that into your final product, and when you present that to the court. So I can kind of see how it goes both ways. As it relates to what we've experienced, we started our pilot program, I guess, back in 2021. Now we're up to about 31,000 uploads a month. We have about 800 staff who are fully trained and operable. We've got about 700,000 uploads in our system. Some of the more significant changes we saw, particularly during the pilot program, was our facilities had a tremendous problem with assaults on staff. And when we did the initial pilot program, we noticed a 54% reduction in the assaults on staff in the units that actually participated in the pilot program. Also, we saw a reduction, significant reduction in just what we call inmate misconducts that may happen in the presence of our staff. Those were some of the more significant reductions that we experienced.
Great, thank you all. I think we're going to have Brittany and Bryce try to respond to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, just so we don't miss anybody. So, and they'll be doing, I think, some of that via the chat. But again, hopefully we'll have some time to entertain audience questions at the end. I wanted to ask the panelists a bit more about the findings related to correctional officer perceptions. I think the word that Bryce used was meh. And a few of you did already mention in your remarks that deputies in your organizations brought the idea to you, but I would describe the results presented by Brittany and Bryce as a little more negative than meh. And I want to ask specifically about the idea that deputies wearing cameras kind of alters the relationship that they have with inmates. In particular, they may not be comfortable kind of telling COs some of the things that they might have confided in before. So just generally speaking, did you see any of that when you rolled out cameras in your organizations? Did you see those kind of negative meh kind of attitudes? And in particular, did you see anything related to any concerns related to the relationships that COs have with the residents or incarcerated individuals?
I can, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with that one. The body-worn camera, the whole concept of it came upon us through some very difficult times in law enforcement. And so the way it was presented, it was more so of at least from a perception of our officers at a particular point, was, hey, we don't trust you guys, and we need to have this video footage so everyone can see and keep an eye and keep you from misconduct, situations of misconduct. And I mean, for a law enforcement officer, I can't think of any worse way to present something as significant as the body-worn cameras, because I really believe that at some point it would have eventually, even without the political stuff, it would be a part of the everyday equipment. It's just the involvement of the how we evolve in law enforcement. It would just be just another piece of equipment. But the way it was presented, at least from the public perception, was that it was very negative. So it was a tough sell for us to change the culture and how it's perceived for them. So we had to go a step further, and we put some teeth behind, so to speak, behind the video footage. So we work closely with our police department. We have some investigators who have powers of arrest. And when these violations were conducted and the body-worn camera was used, if the officer was assaulted or these type of things occurred and the body-worn camera was there, we were assured to have political ramifications as a punishment as well, not just administrative. And so, you know, in a jail, of course, you've got a lot of people who are in a pretrial status, and they're trying to convince a judge that or jury that they're, you know, 2 steps from being a choir boy. And so we're at the last thing they really need is them being on body-worn camera, threatening our staff or threatening another resident or conducting some type of criminal activity, which our prosecutors, the U.S. attorneys here in D.C., would definitely use that, leverage that in the criminal proceedings. So it had some teeth behind it. And that's when we kind of started seeing the tide turn a little bit as far as the reception of the system. Back in January, we had only 6,000 uploads. We're in July and we had 31,000 uploads just in July from staff. So you know, it's catching on, and the tide is, I think, turning as far as with the body-worn cameras.
What I'll say that we've seen that we have discussed through this, and you're looking at it, what we have found is you have those inmates that will talk to you or some that won't talk to you. And now that the body-worn cameras are in progress through back there all the time, and through every time we have contact with one of those that are incarcerated, you find that things are, they're more aware that the camera's there. So what they're saying, what they're doing, and the complaints that they have filed within the past that we didn't have, we're not seeing those complaints anymore. Again, it's used as a better investigation tool. Some of the complaints that we have had, and we've went right back to it. Once you say, look, it's right on body-worn camera, you know, you see the inmates sort of stepping away. I don't feel that it hurt the relationship between the deputies and the inmates. It's just now they're both aware that it's there. The inmate sees it as a protection for them if we do have a problem, and our deputies see it as a protection for them. So it assisted in both directions for us is what we've seen. And I can tell you, you know, like we talk on the RTRs and people were asking that question. RTRs have dropped tremendously, but we've added some other things in there with it. But once they realize that it's there and the footage is there, it made it more crystal clear for everything to be seen and heard. We do have some audio on our closed circuit system, but it's not the greatest, even with the updated cameras and everything. And I think, and once we added the body-worn cameras with that, it's just made it a lot easier for us.
Go off script for a bit with a question that I didn't share with the panelists. I have read a lot of law enforcement agency body-worn camera policies, and it's very common in those policies for an allowance in terms of deactivation if a police officer is interacting with a citizen and a citizen declines to provide information because the camera is recording. It's very common to see in policy that officers have discretion in those kinds of situations to deactivate. I'm just curious, is that kind of language in the body-worn camera policies in your correctional agencies, or is that discretion not provided?
No, it's not discretional. We have it as interactions, rather be face-to-face with the inmate, or in some of our indirect supervision areas, they have the control room and they do a lot of interaction between the intercom or the pass-through slot. And during those times, they're also required to activate. The inmates don't have the choice of saying you need to turn that off. That is something that's grounded in our policy, and it's there to protect our staff and the inmates.
That we are the same as Captain Wozniak, that it's in the policy, anytime, any contact with any of the inmates, that the camera must be activated at all times. And there is the inmate cannot ask for it to be turned off. It must be on at all times.
And that's the same with us. It's in our policy, the de-escalation and all of that's written in our policy in terms of how we interact with the inmates with the body-worn cameras.
I see that John Markovic, Senior Policy Advisor, BJ, has his hand up. So, John, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. I didn't mean to disrupt your flow, Mike. I could have waited, but I think the question has to do with the receptivity of deputies for body-worn cameras. We know in traditional law enforcement settings, generally, officers are overwhelmingly in favor of body-worn cameras. I think early on there had been some resistance, but a lot of officers changed their mind, and probably because they often exonerate the officers when there are complaints. And you know, somebody mentioned showed officers doing good things. So in this study, the perceptions of officers around, I guess, the impact they thought body-worn cameras would have were mixed. So Bryce or Brittany, was that because many were neutral, or was it it's a 5-point Likert scale? Did some of the positive perspectives, were they offset by negative perspectives? I guess what I'm saying is, was there variation among the deputies in their perceptions of body-worn cameras and whether they thought that they contribute to favorable outcomes, or were most of them just sort of neutral?
There was definitely variation. There were some that were more positive, some that were more negative, but most were in like the 2 to 4 range. So even if they were agreed or disagreed with the question, they didn't strongly agree or disagree for the most part, although again, there was variation across everything.
Yeah, and were you able to ascertain whether, what we hear in law enforcement settings is the officers would not want to give them up? Do you think that held true in Loudoun County and in our other sites? Would anybody want to opine on that, once they have them, they don't want to give them up?
Absolutely. I couldn't even imagine this profession now not having body-worn cameras. It's it's just a more just as an important piece of equipment for the officers than any other piece of equipment that they carry or have at their disposal. I can't say enough about just how happy I am that we went into this direction. And we have fixed cameras. We've got close to 1,000 fixed cameras. Like you said earlier, someone said that the fixed cameras don't really give you the full picture. And in corrections versus police departments, our officers, and what I've noticed, because initially we kind of mirrored the DC police policy to some extent when we first started this. And as we went along, we noticed that there's just some serious differences that we didn't even know between police and corrections. And one is that there's more engagement. Our correction officers have more direct engagement than police officers do. So therefore, our officers, once they get on the floor, they have to activate their cameras. Even if it's a peaceful day in the unit, when they make their rounds, their cameras are on. Just because of the fact they have the direct engagement. You don't see that normally in police work. So there's a very different dynamic as it relates to corrections.
All right. The question I was going to ask involving adding body-worn cameras to an already camera-rich environment. I think conventional wisdom would suggest that it's redundant. For the panelists, if someone were to come to you, whether it's a policymaker or a budget person or even a community member, and question the addition of body-worn cameras as something that's redundant, how would you respond to that?
I think it goes back to the education of the public from the get-go. I mean, as a law enforcement leader engaged, I served a community of my metro area was about 250,000. My county itself was about just 180,000, 190,000. And you have to be, you got to inform your public of why you're doing what you're doing. I think that from a sheriff's office perspective, we are so engaged with our community and with those that put us in those seats, that if you go back and can communicate, get your explanation, bring some of your community leaders in, explain why you're going to be doing what you're doing and why you're going to do it. I think a little bit more in this day and age too, it's becoming more of an expectation of the community that you have it than you don't. We become a society of, we want to see that action. We want to see that event. We want to see what's happening. And in most cases, like I said, I go back to, yes, are you going to every now and then catch something wrong? Yes, and deal with it, hold it accountable. But in most cases, you're going to have hundreds of hours of footage of your people doing it right. And you're going to be able to utilize that as you communicate to the public, as you communicate to the budget people. My biggest thing with my commission at the time when we first started doing it, they didn't want to fund it. You know, why do we need that? If we can't trust our cops, why do we need it? I would say, you know, and I'd go back right too, because it's an expectation of the people we serve. They need it, they want it, they expect it. And it's their money. And so we're going to spend it on the things that they want us to spend it on. We've, you know, from my time, you know, I've heard a new term that being thrown around in the law enforcement and communications community of traditionalists. More of a traditionalist going back to the old school. Those days are done. They're gone. And the community has a higher expectation of access to what we're doing and a higher expectation of being able to see what we're doing. And we're going to need to provide that to them. So I think it comes down to communication. It comes down to, you know, communicating with your commissioners, communicating with your budget people. Why? I think the expectation from the public is out there. Get your media involved. I think the fight's going to get easier to get cameras and body-worn cameras in facilities than it's going to be harder, my perspective.
Thanks, Sheriff. Someone else? A thought on that question?
I know with the body worn, with the fixed cameras, you know, typically if an incident occurs and video footage is downloaded, and usually whoever's downloading that video footage, they're going to start just before the beginning of the incident and just as it ends, because it's all visual. There's nothing to support when it should start, when it should end. But when you have an accompanying body-worn camera footage that goes prior to that shows exactly the de-escalation attempts, the sounds, that how some of the residents may be egging a particular inmate on to become violent, and all these other factors that the officers are dealing with just prior to them having to use some type of force to handle the situation. It tells the story. So it augments the camera system. They work hand in hand, but it's leaps and bounds a better tool for us and for the public. It can go in the other direction. We don't want bad apples. No one wants them. And so, you know, it really falls into place in either direction. But what we're learning more than anything else, because of the amount of unlabeled and video footage that we have, we may only label less than 5% of our footage. So there's a lot of footage out there, but it's training opportunities. That's the biggest drive that we, and the biggest advantage we see with the body wounds, especially in corrections. It is a tremendous, tremendous training tool. It's a tremendous tool to use during evaluation periods. It's just a tremendous tool to use to really change the dynamic of how you interact, how you're training people, see how their students put into play the things that they were taught. It's just a whole lot of different ways this thing can be used. So that's where we are with it.
Great. I know we're approaching the hour, and I want to be mindful of people's time. I have other questions, but I'm going to ask Quinn. Have there been some questions that have come in from the audience that we can relay to Bryce and Brittany to respond to?
Yeah, so far we've had actually about 15 questions that Bryce and Brittany and Captain Wozniak have been hard at work answering. So there's just one in the queue that's not been answered yet, which is who is in charge of ensuring that all the videos were categorized, and did every single video need to be categorized by the end of a shift?
I can speak on that. In our particular system, as I say, we have over 1,000 downloads a day. We have 2 body-worn camera coordinators, and we have approximately 16 surveillance center operatives who also assist. Right currently, we label only incident-related footage, primarily. Then secondarily, we do random random, we do daily random video footage reviews. And then thirdly, we look for training opportunities. So those are the three dynamics. So there's quite a bit of footage that's out there that's unlabeled. We call it uneventful, that after a 6-month period is purged. But other than that, I think that's another difference from police to corrections. You're going to have a lot of footage, at least on our end, that you just have footage that's not going to be labeled. And I know from our perspective, no, not every single download is fully reviewed. It would be impossible.
Why don't we take that question to Captain Wozniak, since I think it was probably focused specifically on the study in Loudoun County. Can you respond to the question about tagging videos?
Yeah, what we ended up doing was we already had body-worn cameras in our patrol divisions. So we sort of piggybacked off of those policies and kind of added stuff that we needed to add to it. But one of the question was, did it have to be categorized by the end of shift? Yeah, we would have, when the officer turned over his body cam to a supervisor in order to dock it, at that point it was categorized, whether it was a RTR, so it would be preserved or whatever the case may be. But if it was just a run-of-the-mill end of shift, we didn't categorize anything at that point. It got docked and it got uploaded, and then after the 6-month process, it would fall off the server. During a response to resistance or during an event, the supervisor would secure the camera and they would dock it, and that was just to take any scrutiny off of the deputies that were in, that there was any kind of deletions or anything like that. But all that was done by the end of shift.
Thank you, sir. Quinn, another question. I think I see somebody's hand is raised.
Yeah, so for any attendees that have your hand raised, please just use our Q&A function and submit the question that way. But yeah, we do have a few more questions in the queue here. One is, how would you counter the idea that increased microphones throughout facilities might be as effective in capturing audio as stationary cameras and connecting BWCs with them?
I can answer that from our perspective at our facility. Most of our cameras are mounted upwards, up in the corners, up at the ceilings. So you're not going to get the same point of view as the officer who's engaged with this inmate. So adding microphones to the stationary cameras, although a great idea, I don't think you're going to get the quality and the impact of what that officer is experiencing at that time when we're looking at response to resistance or possible disciplinary issues, to where the officer can be cleared of these things by just the ability of what's his point of view. I think that was one of the biggest things that we noticed when we upgraded our facility camera system. We didn't opt for audio because of the body cams. I think that was a cost savings there also. So that's at least what we did.
Okay, we are at the 1 hour mark. So Quinn, why don't we do one more question?
Is there any thought or intent to have a study where non-law enforcement staff members in a correctional facility use body-worn cameras? So the idea here is that they might capture interactions that COs might not be present to observe, and that might mitigate risk of injury to staff.
We were considering that with our case managers and some selected staff who have interaction with our more interactions in most of our civilian staff have. That's something we've been looking at.
I just chime in there quickly. I think if you take it out of the correctional setting, we do, in our grant program, we have seen a handful of agencies apply on behalf of civilian personnel. Parking enforcement comes to mind, and there were a few others that are not coming to mind. But it is, for those who have interactions with the public, where there may be confrontations, complaints, or just some rationale for documenting. We're seeing it bubble up, although it's not common, but we have seen some in some of our grant requests.
There's been studies and implementations of body cameras in other settings. I think hospital settings and other medical settings come to mind. And I've seen work done in that area. So it could certainly be something that's done in a correctional setting at some point. I think for this study, the focus was on the most immediate need, which is that kind of deputy resident interaction. And we wanted to see what the impact there was. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, that's EMTs are, you're seeing a lot of advocacy for EMTs wearing body worn cameras. It's not something we would fund because we're focused on law enforcement and corrections, but there's definitely a push for other professionals to use them.
You know, I think from a sheriff's perspective, and I'm going to put this right back on Captain Wozniak and Major Hatfield, you know, you're always constantly assessing your environment. And as leadership, if you're constantly looking at your environment, there are things going to come up and things that appear that maybe are a great answer at the time. I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer to whether you would put it on civilians. If Major Hatfield comes to me and I'm his sheriff and he says, hey, I want to put this on so-and-so and so-and-so because of their interactions. Maybe it's their commissary people. Maybe they're having some interactions with different things. I think every facility should be assessing all times what's the best thing. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer for who's asking that question. Assess your facility, and if you feel it's an appropriate place to put a body camera, then do it. And I think your jail administrators are going to have a great handle on who they want wearing the cameras.
And I'll answer that after Sheriff Laney there. We currently contracted out our kitchen staff. They're with trustees, inmates that are working with inside the kitchen facility. So that's something that I'm currently looking at because they're in there. There's no guard around. There's nobody there, and we rely on them for the safety and the interaction and everything else that has occurred. Also, we're going to have another position come up where court liaison between the deputies and the inmates. And again, you're going to have civilians dealing with the inmates constantly and dealing with the staff. So at that point in time, that's where I would look at, as you asked the question on the civilian wearing it, where I think it would be needed for the protection and the safety of everything.
And with that is being said, we've also looked at it. There are a couple positions that we have ruled out that we don't want to wear them. We have 16 clinicians here for mental health, and they do a lot of release planning and things like that. And of course, we can't just, put those cameras in those type of situations because they want the inmates to open up, and inmates tend to shut down a little bit more when there's a body cam. But our senior cooks who do supervise inmate workers in the kitchen is something that we have been volleying back and forth, and we just haven't come up with a definitive are we or are we not going to at this point. But I have to agree with Sheriff Lane. If you feel the need to have them, put them on them, and you can always adjust if it was the wrong call.
All right, thanks everyone. I think we'll have to call it at that point. We're well past the hour. I just want to take this opportunity to thank both Doctors Cunningham and Peterson for presenting their results. You can reach out to them if you would like to see the published articles that are in the pipeline that provide much more detail on the findings that were presented here. I also want to thank our panelists for their participation and their very thoughtful comments on the study specifically, and then generally on their experiences with correctional BWCs. We have recorded this event, so within probably a couple of days or a week, we'll have this publicly available. Also, if you have additional questions that you didn't get to ask, please feel free to fire them to Quinn or the emails that you see on the screen. Thanks everyone for your time. I hope you found the webinar useful, and have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.